tremendous performance. Bobby Allison, the leader of the Alabama gang.
I got to give a tremendous amount of credit to Bud Moore. Car did run perfectly all day.
Pearson gives his car a breathtaking ride down the front stretch and into first place.
Running like a thief in the backstretch, it's Jarrett, number 11, making a move.
Lee Petty in number 42, still running wide open.
Lee Petty takes command of the race.
Welcome to the NASCAR Hall of Fame biography of Lee Petty, NASCAR's first career racer. He was a man chasing a paycheck just as hard as he chased a checkered flag or a championship, making a business out of racing as well as creating a family dynasty. Lee's success was hard fought, but readily earned by the man who many consider the toughest racer of them all.
My name is Elizabeth Toombs Petty, and I was born and raised right here in Level Cross, North Carolina. Just like my folks, their folks before them, and my children who came after. I was married to Lee Petty for near about 64 years. And for all but the first few of them years, I tell folks my husband was kindly married to racing just as well. Family's history we got kept up in our shop. Photos, picture books, newspaper clippings. We keep all our history locked up in Lee's little old office. Sometimes I still like to walk out and look at them. I just like to remember.
Never ever let us part.
Yeah, he grew up in Greensboro, which is up the road of like 10 or 12 miles. Back then, every little community had a baseball team. And he came down here and played baseball. And that's where he met my mother. My dad was just a hot rodder, okay? And he had a couple of trucks. He did a lot of trucking. Sometimes he'd raise some pigs. Sometimes we'd raise tomatoes in the summer. You know, he'd done a little bit of everything.
The area was known for making white liquor, and that's how people got by. That's how they made their money.
My grandmother's family made moonshine. The Toombs family made some moonshine. I'm not sure my grandfather ever made it, but he hauled it.
I can remember him making his deliveries in around Greensboro, and Mom and Richard and myself would get in the car, and I'd sit in the car on cases of liquor, just riding through town or around like a family deal.
He always had a hot rod, and he was always interested in, you know, making them go faster, and they'd race up and down the road. People come from all over the country and came here to race him. And they bet big money. So they had a kind of an outlaw racing circuit.
I remember one time having this little bag of money, I mean, it plumb full of money, and out they went. And don't ask me who brought the money back, I don't know.
Money usually stayed in Randolph County.
They raced, they ran liquor, and they chicken fought. They went to chicken fights all the time. I mean, that was part of what you did in the South in the 40s and on up into the early 50s.
Once the two boys started growing up, I was awful relieved when Lee decided that maybe it was time to start making a living doing things that wasn't going to keep stirring up the law. So when he seen a clipping in the newspaper about this man from Florida who was putting on a race for money down in Charlotte, well, sir, Lee just knew that this was something he needed to see for himself.
They hung out at a service station on the south side of Greensboro, and these These boys up there had a Buick, and it was real fast on the road, so Daddy talked them into loaning in the car. The Sunday came to go to the race, then my brother, myself, my mother, and my daddy, we got in the car and we drove to Charlotte. When we got to Charlotte, they went into the Texaco station, put it up on a lift, jacked it up, greased the thing, changed the oil, took the mufflers off, put a number on the side of the thing, and went to the racetrack. Halfway through the race or something, I think it broke a rear bar in the car and it tore the car all to pieces. I don't know how they explained it to the guys that borrowed the car from them.
Most ladies probably would have fainted if their husband told them they wanted to go racing to put food on the table. Especially when Lee wrecked the neighbor's car in his very first race. But I never in my life seen Lee so set on something. One thing about Lee Petty, when that man set his mind on something, ain't nothing gonna stand in his way.
I think he sat down with my mother and they had a little discussion. He said, you know, if we can go into the racing business, I can get out of the trucking business, I'll have a regular deal, have something going.
For my grandmother, I think for her to follow him was total devotion, to say I'm gonna follow him down that road. And I don't think anybody knew where it was gonna come out. He felt he could outdrive anybody. Obviously, he was confident. Mechanically, he felt like his brothers and he and the family and the group they'd put together could go out and do it. And I think once that started and he saw it was organized and he saw he could make money at it, it was all about the cash. It wasn't about the trophies.
I could go down to the Chrysler place and buy a Plymouth for $900. And I could take that car and win races with it. Of course, didn't pay but $1,000, but I didn't have nothing invested.
Lee Petty was among the first to look to NASCAR as a business. I mean, this is how he put food on the table. He didn't have a side job and race on weekends, so he had to perform.
Lee Petty, driving car number 42, takes command of the race.
Survival was his main motivation. He never wanted to be the hero. He wasn't really trying to be rich or nothing. He was just trying to supply for his family. And naturally, he wanted to make as good a living as he could. But the main deal there was just, I got to do something to make a living. And I enjoy this, I like it, I do pretty good at it. And so he just pursued it, I think, more from survival than he did anything else.
Well, we had to win, especially in 1949 and 50. We go to the racetrack and we was lucky to have enough food, enough gas to get to the racetrack. That's the truth. In other words, we even carried our sandwich with it. We even, when we left home, we drove the race car to the racetrack. I drove a race car all the way from here to California and raced. I drove it all the way to New York, raced, Canada. We didn't have no luxury at all.
My first experience with Lee, I was at West Palm Beach, and he came to the racetrack in the car with Elizabeth and Richard and Maurice, and Lee flipped during the race, and it bowed the roof all up, knocked the windshield out, and after the race, I seen them all load up, tires, jack, and everything, and went back to Randleman, North Carolina in that car with no windshield. This was in the winter.
Them first few years of racing was hard, but they was fun too. For a country girl from Level Cross, North Carolina, going all over the country to all them racetracks was exciting. And whatever we done as family.
For my grandmother and my grandfather and for Uncle Maurice and my father, it became their life and their way of life. They basically became gypsies in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we were just kids, and mother, my dad, Richard and myself, and we'd travel all over. They had like 2 circuits. They had a short track circuit back in and Grand National, and he would hit them all if he could.
There's Maurice Petty, and there's Mama Petty and Papa Lee Petty, and that's Richard Petty on the right. Look how little Maurice is.
While I was running, naturally, it had taken a lot of work to do it, and so beginning of their experience in racing was through helping me build this little 49, 50, and 51 Plymouth, which we went all over the country and raced.
He was big about keeping his car clean, and we had to scrape the mud off and, you know, help change oil. And the more things he had us to do and that he could see that we could do it, then the more he put on us.
It was always a family business from the very beginning. My grandfather would go out and drive the car. My father and my uncle helped work on the car, even though they were only 10 or 11 years old at the time. My grandmother kept the books and looked after everything, made sure the hotels were paid, made sure the bills were paid, made sure everybody had food.
First time I saw Lee Petty was up in just a track somewhere near south of Albany, and it was just he and his wife. And I remember that they had a wicker basket in the trunk that she was taking the food out, and he was eating fried chicken and drinking a quart of milk, and I was looking at that, boy, was I hungry.
Back in the era, there was a lot of rascals racing back then, and he really was prominent with his family. So he had a determination that a lot of the other guys maybe didn't have.
My grandfather was not that guy that you'd find in a bar. You know, you don't lay out until 2 o'clock in the morning and then try to drive a race car because you're already beat. I got that guy beat. You know, I'm sure he could walk through the garage area at a local track on a Sunday afternoon and know that he already had 2/3 of the field beat because he knew where all those guys were last night.
The drivers for the first 4 or 5 years were not professional drivers, so from that standpoint, he sort of had a heads up on them because he was trying to be a professional, make money out of it, where they was just having fun with it.
He knew how to get the most out of his car, and he knew how to build it. He knew exactly what he was looking for back in the day when there wasn't, you know, a book to open up and go, boy, that worked last year, or this or that.
They worked hard and they made every race, and they kept the car on the track. Most of those races were like a demolition derby. Who was going to get through the whole race and not crash or take somebody else out or burn their car up or whatever. But he figured out how to keep them going and keep them finishing.
At that time, the cars were so stocked that they were blowing up or breaking wheels or, you know, getting hot, whatever. He said, if I just pedal around all day and finish the race, then I'm gonna make money. So he was always known as Mr. Consistency because he finished like 90% of the races he ever started.
Sure enough, Lee was making this NASCAR deal work. And turns out, he was pretty darn good at it too. After a couple years, he was kindly one of the best drivers at every track we went to. And by 1954, he'd won himself the NASCAR Grand National Championship. Most folks might have been satisfied after winning themselves a NASCAR championship. But Lee Petty wasn't most folks. He was always looking down the road, always looking for the next big thing ahead.
In his early career, he won races because he outthought people or outfinished people. Then by 1954, my daddy got out of the six-cylinder stuff, and then he started really racing with people.
Now we have a battle for the lead between Tim Flock in 91 and Lee Petty in 42.
Petty's number 42 eats up the track as the North Carolinian in his 1954 Chrysler heads the field for the first 81 miles.
Lee Petty still running wide open, setting a pace that means trouble to slower drivers.
When he got the faster car, then that's when he started kind of leaning on people from time to time.
You had people you knew you couldn't bump around, and he was one of them. Lee Petty would, he'd turn you around faster than you could say his name.
Petty and Weatherly are still fighting it out for second. Weatherly spins. Lee Petty gets straightened out and heads for the checkered flag.
Lee was a dirty racer. He won't appreciate that, but he's the guy that put me out of business at Darlington in '57.
Petty and Turner are in a furious battle for the lead. Turner is in real trouble.
He didn't have any etiquette, and he didn't know any racing rules. And I always said, if anybody asked me, I would always say he was like a bull in a china shop.
He was hard. He ran heavy. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to set cars up, which was a big plus for him. And if in the race, if you come up, if you're trying to pass him, he would fight you right down to the end, even if you were coming up to lap him. You know, if he had an off day and you were going to lap him, he'd fight you right down to the end.
He was very aggressive and a good race driver. When I first started, I was real young into it, and I was leading a race at North Wilkesboro. We had about 5 laps to go, and I was going to win the race, but that didn't happen. I went down a front stretch and went in the corner, and he just tapped me, and up against the fence I went, and he went over on the race.
He was known to be a little rough. In the Hall of Fame, up in the Petty family case, we have a letter from Pat Purcell, who was the vice president of NASCAR, written to Lee in 1956, saying that he's been getting so many complaints about Lee's rough driving.
He paid no attention to that. He didn't care. And it's not that he had thick skin. He just did not care what you thought about him. He went out there, he's standing in victory lane, he gets to take home the check, and you're whining about because you get your fender knocked in or your bumper knocked in or something like that. Didn't bother him in the slightest.
Lee, if he needed to, could be quite emphatic with a car, and he wouldn't mind now and then making sure that somebody else understood what the rules of the game were. He was a tough guy.
When the race was over, if he had anything to say, wouldn't take his helmet off. Right away, you know if the guy wants to fight or not. If he takes his helmet off, we want to have a discussion, fine. If he leaves his helmet on, that means,
He's one of the few people I ever went down to see after a race and ended up apologizing for being on the outside of him because he needed the racetrack to run off the corner. He said, son, I wasn't going to turn that car down and spin it out. You stuck your nose in there, and I ended up apologizing for being in the right place on the right side of his car.
Lee Petty was one tough son of a gun. He raced for money, didn't give a hoot about the trophies. He was there for one reason: he thought he could make a buck at it. And that was Lee Petty. And he didn't hide it. He didn't in any way present himself in a different way than, I know why I'm here, and this is why I'm here, and I'm a guy that can be successful at it. And he was.
Sure enough, 4 years after winning his first championship, Lee done won himself his second. Times were kindly good for the Petty family. Our son Richard had just started racing himself too. But that didn't mean Lee was gonna cut him no slack.
I started in '58, and I started with the '57 Oldsmobiles. When we sat down and looked at it, and the way he looked at it, we got to make money in what we're doing. And he said, okay, you run the convertible circuit, and I'll run the stock car circuit, and then we won't be racing against each other. I guess they had a few races that we ran in the same race. One of them was a 150-mile race at Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta. we go run all day, and the place is really dusty and dirty. They flagged me the winner. I had never won a race, okay? So this is great, man. Somebody comes up and says, hey, somebody's protested the race. And I said, what did we do wrong? They said, well, they think they run more laps than you did. And turned around there and it was my dad.
He took his son's victory away from him, protested his son's first win. And of course, Lee was right. Well, there's still some question about that, but nobody's going to argue with Lee if Richard said surrender.
By the start of the 1959 season, the Petty family was kindly on top of the world. My husband Lee was the NASCAR champion, and my son Richard was going to be racing his first full season. And that year started with the biggest race of them all, the very first Daytona 500. I can still remember when the entry form arrived in the mail, and I could not believe they wanted to charge us an extra $1 just to park our cars in that big old infield.
59 Daytona was the first time that they run from the beach, okay? We went over to the big speedway, and nobody knew what to expect. We go down there, and there's a great big 2.5 mile humongous racetrack.
The famous Daytona International Speedway, a 2.5 mile tri-oval course that's said to be the fastest track in the world.
That great big new track Mr. Bill France had built was making all the drivers nervous, and kindly us wives too. And as the day of the big race got closer, that was all anybody could talk about.
It's like going to your first movie. You don't know what's going to happen, you know what I mean? And so, therefore, nobody had any knowledge of it. You know, nobody had been down here in practice or nothing.
Nobody had ever run on a track that big and them banks that steep. And, you know, the word was around that I remember them talking about was, how in the world are we going to race on this thing?
It scared the hell out of me, I'll put it that way. And it didn't only scare me, it scared everybody that come down in through that tunnel. Because we'd been running half a mile, quarter miles, and maybe a mile track now and then. And we look up there and see this monster, you know what I mean? And God, people's eyes popped out of their head. And so I said, well, to myself, I said, those fellas ain't got no more experience to run this dang race car than I have. And so I said, I'll just get in there and run wide open. That's what I did.
A lot of people talk about seeing the racetrack and maybe being afraid of it. I think some quote of Lee's is saying that somebody will get killed here and this, that, and the other on as far. It didn't excite me one bit.
The race is on.
I start the race and run 5 or 6 laps and blow the engine up on the car.
22-year-old Petty has burned out his engine trying to keep up with a faster sedan. Young Petty is finished, a victim of ambition.
I get out of the car and I go down to Diggs Pit. The big deal was it came down to the last race, him and Johnny Beauchamp.
Now the race has developed into a duel between Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp. They trade the front spot back and forth right down to the finish.
And came down to the very last lap.
As they come to the line, Beauchamp on the bottom spurts forward. Petty is in the middle, Weatherly above.
When they come across, then we said, oh man, we just won the race. And they thought he won the race, so they didn't have a winner's circle. They pulled down in the grass right in front of the start-finish line. France comes down and says, y'all done good today, you're in second. And man, I mean, that kind of teed Diddy off, you know what I mean?
Johnny Beauchamp, he and I were running on the last lap. And going out of the third turn, up fourth turn there, he went high and I went low. I went across the finish line. Somebody said, well, how'd you know you won the race? I said, I looked out the window, and I had to look back when I went across the finish line.
We went around and around for 2 or 3 days, and we'd been hanging out at the NASCAR headquarters. You know, we'd been everywhere, talked to everybody, and there was nothing we could do except wait on what the decision was going to be, and they finally told us on Wednesday morning.
Lee always stuck up for what he thought was right. And after all that fussing, NASCAR finally declared he was right too. He won himself the very first Daytona 500, which come with a trophy and a great big check. Now, he says all he cared about was the money. But you look in them eyes and you tell me winning that race didn't mean the world to him.
At that particular time, that was the world's beater race. You know, if you won that thing, you was a man that is way above everybody else in racing.
He was the first guy to win 3 championships. From 1949 through 1959, those seasons, he never finished out of the top 5 in points. Tremendous.
Who'd have thought that just 10 years after wrecking in his first race, Lee would become the very first 3-time champion in all of NASCAR? He was only 45 years old, so we just figured he'd kindly keep on racing forever. During the late 50s and the early 60s, the years kindly did fly by. Our family's racing business was booming. The same year that Lee won that first Daytona 500 and his 3rd season championship, Richard won himself the Rookie of the Year trophy. 2 years later, we was back down in Daytona getting ready for the 1961 Daytona 500. But before the big race, Lee and Richard was running in the heat races.
They'd run a 100-mile race before that, and I was in it. And I'd crashed and went out of the first turn, went over the bank, hit a fence downstairs, and I'd got glass in my eye. And just as I walked out of the infirmary, they said Lee Petty just went through the guardrail.
I saw the wreck, and I just couldn't believe it. But I just, you know, I just got shook up. And I saw all this mess, blood all over the place. And then I got back in my car, and I couldn't even buckle my seatbelt. That's how shook up I was.
I go running down that way, and the time I get there and get to the top of the deal, people everywhere, the cars all tore all to pieces. So they done put him in the ambulance and they take him off.
When I got up there to see what was going on, they done pretty well got him in the ambulance and taken him to the hospital. And I looked around and I didn't see a darn soul I knew, so I had to hitch me a ride to the hospital.
When we get there, we go into the emergency room and you can just see where Daddy'd been because there's just blood. They can just follow. That's how bad he was bleeding. Anyhow, so we go in, we wait a little while, and then the doctors come out and said, well, we're going to try to save his life. It tore his knee up, punctured his lung, broke a bunch of ribs. So the first 3 or 4 days, all they tried to do was keep him alive. I remember going in there on, I think it was Monday, and me and my brother went in, and they had him pretty doped up, you know, and he come over and he said, come here. He said, now you and Marsh go on home, go up to the local Plymouth dealership and get a new car, and y'all start working on it, and me and Mama will be home probably about Friday. 4 months later on Friday, he comes home.
He had to go through rehab down there. Him and his mother stayed down there. So it was up to Richard and myself to keep everything going.
Where Lee Petty had been the breadwinner for Elizabeth and Maurice and Richard, and they had always deferred to what his wishes were. Now he's laying in a hospital, just clinging to life in Daytona Beach, but life doesn't stop for their family. My father and Uncle Maurice had to go back home, put together a car, and go to the next race.
I spent 4 months down in Daytona sitting by my husband's side. And thanks to all the blessings of our Lord, Lee healed up. But even when he was stuck in that hospital, he kept his mind on racing.
This is Bob Smith of WNDB Sports Department at the hospital bedside of Lee Petty, world-famous stock car driver from Randleman, North Carolina. Lee, as you know, is presently recovering from injuries received in a race here at Daytona Beach on February the 24th. Lee, how are you today?
Bob, I'm feeling real good, and I'm glad you was able to come over today because I think I feel better today, and I want to say hello to all my friends, and plus I'm looking forward to the race, and maybe Richard will win it to make me feel lots better.
Lee Petty, we want to thank you very much for allowing us to come into your hospital room here today.
Bob, it's really been a pleasure that I was able to do this for you, plus all the friends and the people over the radio throughout the country today.
Recovering down in Florida wasn't all bad. Being down in Daytona Beach kindly felt like being on a vacation. But after 4 months in a hospital, y'all best believe that Lee was itching to get back to the racetrack.
And here we go. The pace lap is underway with Lee Petty driving the pace car for the Firecracker 250. Lee Petty, one of the all-time greats, former three-time NASCAR Grand National Circuit champion who was injured here in February, and we're very happy to see him back out on the track.
He came back and ran a couple of races, and he ran at Martinsville. And when the race was over, he got out and said, "It ain't fun no more." So that's it.
Lee Petty, 3 times NASCAR national champion, has retired from driving, not racing. He's crew chief for his son, Richard, who has taken over the wheel.
I don't feel like now that I've got to prove to anybody, not special to myself, that I was a pretty good driver back then, and then have somebody in your own family come along is good. Or, in fact, I classify him a lot better driver than I ever was.
Everybody called him the boss man, okay? We did too.
Man, he was the boss man. He always was the boss man. If he's alive today, he'd still be the boss man.
He was almost a harder pit man or you know, running a team. He was almost a harder nosed guy in that position than he was a driver.
Oh, he was a hard boss, really hard. My father would win a race by 2 laps, and the first question Monday morning was, why didn't you win it by 3 laps? Nothing was ever good enough for him.
We went to what we call a Northern Tour, and we ran 4 races. So we come home, he comes out on the back porch, and we come up and we're just grinning all over ourselves because we won 3 races and run second in another one. What does he say? What happened? I said, well, I mean, what happened? Why did you run second? Why didn't you win that race?
No, he didn't come up and give you no pat on the back for you done good or you're doing good or none of that. You know, it's just like, he from the old school, you know, this is what you're supposed to do and this is how you're gonna do it.
And there's the checkered flag for Richard Petty, the winner of the 6th annual Daytona 500.
Richard Petty rose into the winner's circle as his father did 5 years ago. For the Pettys, Lee and Richard, there's nothing like checkered flags to make happy times.
With checkered flags came paychecks, and that's what made Lee happiest of all. Richard and Morris kept winning races, and before too long, they was winning championships, just like their daddy. And the more the boys won, the more Lee just kind of stepped back and let them do their deal.
One good thing about him, even though he was a hard head, He let us do our own stuff. He let my brother and myself. He said, okay, you know, y'all's kind of running the show now, even though he'd come in and try to tell you what was going on.
Richard Petty wins the Southern 500.
Richard Petty, a man who today at the Darlington Raceway made racing history. With his father, the man whose record he broke. Lee, how do you feel about all this?
Feel real good, Chris. I think he drove a real good race. The car handled good, and we had all the luck with us. A lot of times you don't get up to 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and don't come to work a little late. Now what's the deal on that?
Well, I don't know. You know, just as long as I can get there on race day and do my job and wind up winning a race now and then I don't think that any of us got a whole lot of complaint.
Well, the name of the game is to win races, and I've always been a real big fan of Lee Petty, and now I've changed all that. Now I'm a big fan of Richard Petty.
Well, I hope so. It works out better for both of us that way right now.
It means more money in the pocketbook, don't it?
It really does. When it comes to paying the taxes and everything, it's better if one of us is working.
He became more of, I would say, soft-hearted. I don't say he was any nicer or any worse. He just mellowed out.
Well, Lee Petty, Richard's father, has just come out of the hospital. Lee, what did you learn?
Well, I went in there. It looks like somebody spun down there, and somebody hit him right in the back, and it drove him right in the fence. And I just got through talking to him, and he hurt his foot, but I believe he'll be able to plow tomorrow.
You think he'll be able to plow? They're going to put him right back on the farm. Now, boy, I'll tell you, if that isn't humor or I don't know how you do it, you fellas.
I think he'll be able to plow tomorrow.
Okay, well, we're certainly happy that you can smile about it and that Richard Petty is okay.
Even though Lee made fun, I knew he was proud of his boys and what they accomplished. They'd won 7 NASCAR championships, and ain't no one ever done that before. Every year, we put together an open house at the race shop. And every year, the lines got longer, and I could just tell by looking at Lee how proud of the boys he really was.
Lee Petty, you were one of the sport's first great champions. But of all the champions in stock car racing, Richard Petty is the greatest. As you look out here and see all these people and know of Richard's success, what does it mean to you?
It's what you call an inner satisfaction. I really can't express it, but it's an inner satisfaction that you accomplish and it materialize over the years.
As days gone by, Lee started going to the racetrack less and less. And more, he was kindly picking up them golf clubs and carrying on with his new favorite pastime.
There's another kind of competition. Not so noisy as racing, but just as tense and hard-fought. Golf. The Pure Firebird Invitational Golf Tournament at the Darlington Country Club draws some of the Southeast's top amateur players. Some folks think that golf's the greatest game there is, but they never drove a stock car, except Lee Petty, Richard's father. Lee won himself 3 NASCAR championships before retiring to this game.
He changed racing and put golf in that. That was his hobby. He'd get out here in the front yard and knock balls and knock the windows out of the garage over there. That was what he lived for. I mean, he'd get up in the morning, it didn't make any difference what kind of weather it was. He'd put on old cotton gloves or whatever and go out here and knock golf balls.
Basically, he had a 4-acre front yard that he would hit golf balls from one side to the other and then walk across the yard and hit them back and then walk back and hit them back and forth. And the backyard had an immaculate putting green. I mean, I'm telling you, Augusta would have lived for this putting green. It was amazing.
He hung out up here at the local golf course, and Mother called it the Glory Hole. So I said, where's Daddy? He's up the Glory Hole.
When he come back from the golf game, I'd say, Dad, how'd you do? He said, well, I lost $100 or $500. Or I said, how did you do that? He said, well, we was betting, and I didn't win it, so I lost it.
In later years, he would complain about having to come take photos all the time. always complained. Never wanted to have his picture taken, never wanted to come down out of the house to have to aggravate with that. He wanted to go to the golf course, he wanted to do what he wanted to do.
Yeah, it costs me every time you take a picture. Yes, it costs you. I know. All right.
We used to have a lot of people that call up and said, you know, we want to come and interview your dad. And I said, you can't do that. He will not sit still and do an interview.
You can just keep walking. Hey.
Randy Pemberton, good to see you. How are you?
Sure good to be around, I'm telling you.
You're looking terrific.
Oh, you're kidding me.
No, I'm not kidding you.
Yeah,
You do look good. Hey, what is the chances? We've asked Chip if there would be a possibility he would sit down with us for like 5 minutes.
Who said that?
I asked Chip over the course of the last couple weeks. He said he would ask you. It would mean an awful lot to us.
I don't know whether he didn't like the publicity or whether he didn't want to be bragging on himself as far as telling his accomplishments. I know deep down he was proud of what my brother and myself and what Petty Enterprises had accomplished and what he accomplished, but the kind of person he was and his personality, you would have never known it.
Here's a guy that grew up just living hand to mouth, gets married, has a family, still living hand to mouth. They lived in a boxcar in an old construction trailer for a number of years. He starts racing, he does this stuff, and you know, he did it on his own. Nobody gave him a hand up, nobody gave him a handout, and he used to always say, you know, if anybody gives you anything for free, it's probably worth nothing. That's what it's worth. You gotta work for what you get, and that's what he truly believed.
Lee Petty was the first professional race car driver that NASCAR had. He was the first professional mechanic they had. He was the first professional owner. So he was the stable that Bill France could build off of, because if they had a race, Lee Petty was going to be there. So I think his biggest contribution was being here, doing the thing, and showing people that you could make a living out of driving a race car. He was in really, really good health, okay? But he had a stomach aneurysm. So the doctors decided, I think our best chance of him living longer is an operation. He just never overcame the operation.
Well, it's hard on anybody to lose their dad. I mean, you know, it's just, but just hard, but you had to get on with it. You know, that's life.
It's always hard to lose a mother or daddy. It don't make any difference whether you like them or you don't like them or whatever, because they're the reason you existed. You know, he'd been here 86 years, okay? And he'd been our foundation. So when you look at it from that standpoint, it was definitely a big, big loss, because he'd been here so long, you just never thought about him being anything except coming to the garage and aggravating.
Well, I always figured that when a day is a man born, his days are numbered, and when he lives that lifetime and when he dies, it's all back to dust. And no use to remember. Why remember a dead person? Because there's too many people living in this world. Them are the people you gotta put your mind to.
What else ought a man say about his life? My husband was never one to fuss over himself. As far as he was concerned, all them races and trophies were nice, but it was the paychecks that mattered. That's how he put food on our table. Lee Petty always put his family first, and that's how my husband ought to be remembered.
Never ever say goodbye.